A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Katarina Bridekind. I am Policy Advisor on Humanitarian Assistance for FENRO, the German Humanitarian and Development NGO network, and I will be your host today. In this online seminar, we will have a closer look at humanitarian action and the environment. And I will start with a quote today taken from the Sphere Handbook that you all might be aware of, I guess. And in the Humanitarian Charter in Chapter 9, you will find the sentence, "We are aware that attempts to provide humanitarian assistance may sometimes have unintended adverse effects. In collaboration with affected communities and authorities, we aim to minimize any negative effects of humanitarian action on the local community or on the environment." So environment is present in the Sphere Handbook and I guess in many other important documents for humanitarian actors as well. And to my mind, the topic has become more and more important and more prominent during the last years, also in humanitarian action. And today we would like to give you an idea of how you can reduce your carbon footprint and include the environment more in humanitarian work. I have three guests with me today who will give inputs. They are Arnina Beciri. She's finishing her master's degree in international humanitarian action at the University of Malta. And she's currently a trainee at the Global Survivors Fund and has gained experience in humanitarian action in Lebanon, where also her interest in environmental mainstreaming started. Thanks for joining us, Arnina.
Thank you.
I would also like to welcome Katarina Bridekind. She has been working for Klimakollekte since 2018, and she's the contact person for education and cooperation. And she conducts, for example, initial consultations on carbon footprint, offsetting, and the implementation of climate management systems. Happy to have you here, Katarina.
Thank you.
And Matt Zarsicki is joining us. Matt works for Catholic Relief Services in the States as a technical advisor for disaster risk reduction and resilience. And Matt works alongside CAFOD and Caritas Australia as the coordinator of the DRR and Resilience Working Group, in which all of the three agencies are actively engaged. And the working group is tasked with developing tools and resources to strengthen resilience programming. And the environmental stewardship tool that Matt will present later in the seminar was developed as part of this initiative. Thanks that you're with us today, Matt, especially early morning for you. Great to have you.
Thank you.
As you have seen in the program, in the next 2 hours, we will have a short flashlight by Arnina and then 3 inputs. And after each input, we will have a short Q&A session. Before we start with the inputs, I would be glad to see who is joining us today. I would like to know which organizations are taking part today. Good. Okay, I will show you the second question, which is an easy one as well. Please let us know in which country you are based in. Thanks a lot for this overview. So now we've all got a small idea of who's taking part today and where you are working. I would like to ask Arnina now to get us started with a short flashlight by telling us about challenges humanitarian NGOs face when taking environment into consideration. And she has done research on environmental mainstreaming for her master's thesis and would like to share some results with us.
So as Carolina said, I'm writing my master thesis on the challenges of environmental mainstreaming in humanitarian aid. Before we start, I'd just like to provide you with a proposed definition of environmental mainstreaming provided by the UNEP-OCHA Joint Environment Unit. They define environmental mainstreaming as the active, timely, and systematic inclusion of environmental concerns as an intersectoral issue at all stages of humanitarian action with the aim to protect lives, livelihoods, and sustainable resource management. So in this definition, obviously the main objective of humanitarian aid is highlighted, which is to save lives, but it is also acknowledging that this is possible while including environmental concerns while including environmental concerns in the work. What does this look like practically? It does not only mean that you think about, it means that you do think about recycling, you're traveling as a humanitarian organization, the kind of products that you're using and so forth, but it also means that you think about it not only on the operational side, but also your program side. So, for example, when you do a stakeholder analysis, you think about the environmental actors that are in the region that you're working in. When you assess the risks, you also think about the environmental risks. So, for instance, if you have a refugee camp, there's a tool available called Need Plus that assesses the vulnerabilities in the environment surrounding the refugee camp, or, for example, what kind of effect your activities may have on the environment. In terms of projects, you could integrate the environment in a cash for work projects where you provide cash for recycling work or an education program. So yeah, it's important to really integrate it in every step. Of course, it's not always easy and possible, but it's important to think about it. So while interviewing, there were of course many challenges that were mentioned. One of the challenges that I identified myself was that we don't really have a universal way of understanding environmental mainstreaming. So we all have a different definition, and that's because everyone was exposed, or has not been exposed yet, but has been exposed to it differently. So especially small organizations, they had difficulty defining environmental mainstreaming because it did not come up with their donors, or they had no trainings regarding that. Then there was also the fact that a lot of respondents, they defined environmental mainstreaming, but in addition to talking about what is still missing, what needs to be done. So it shows that, we're still in the developing phase of environmental mainstreaming. And then, of course, there's the issue of funding. So there's an impression that environmental mainstreaming can cost a lot of money, which is true. I mean, sometimes you do need to invest upfront, but there are also simple ways where you can at least minimize or improve your environmental impact, and then it doesn't have to cost that much. But of course, there's the issue that organizations often have to take it out of their own budget, which is not something that's easier. Humanitarian organization would rather invest it in something else that is related in their eyes to humanitarian aid, but I do not necessarily think that environment is related to humanitarian aid. I will be speaking about that later in more detail. Then there's, of course, the context that humanitarian organizations are working in. That was mentioned to be quite a challenge. It's very volatile. There's not a lot of time. There are things that you can't control. I'm sure that many of you have been in situations where, there's an emergency situation, and afterwards you look around and you realize, there's a lot of plastic bottles, water bottles, jerry cans lying, and you realize, okay, we could have done this differently, but during that time, it's not something that you planned. So it's important that afterwards you think about how you could have done it differently to see whether there are solutions towards these situations. Does that mean that environmental mainstreaming is impossible? I would say no. And my colleagues, they will talk a bit more of how you can integrate the environment into your work. Thank you.
Great, thanks Arnina for this first flashlight and insights into your research. As we can see, there are diverse challenges regarding environmental aspects in humanitarian action. And I hope that during this seminar, we will learn how to handle at least some of them. And we will hear from Katarina now about carbon offsetting, and she will give us a brief overview, and afterwards we'll take a few minutes to look at your questions.
Okay, thank you, Carolina. My name is Katarina, and I work for the Klima Collector since 2018. And I would like to start with a very short introduction into climate change and climate justice. And then, I would let you know what the Klima Collector is doing, what is our service. And as one part of our work, we account the carbon footprint. So we will talk about that. And as we are an offset organization, we will learn today about carbon dioxide offsetting. And last but not least, I would like to show you one of our projects and example carbon footprints. So what I would like to start with the MCC's carbon dioxide clock, which illustrates how much carbon dioxide may be released into the atmosphere to limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 or better or worse 2 degrees. And the scientific basis for this clock is the data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And as you can see, the time that is left to achieve the 2-degree target is only about 25 years. And for the 1.5 scenario, it's only 7 years left, or almost 8. And what we all have learned recently from the latest IPCC report is that the human-induced greenhouse gas emissions are clearly the cause for past and future warming of the climate system, and that numerous climate impacts have occurred rapidly and can be directly attributed to the anthropogenic greenhouse effect, and that the climate impacts have become more intense and more frequent and will continue to do so in the coming decades. So, but obviously not all people and not all countries contribute equally to climate change. Carbon dioxide emissions are very unevenly distributed in the industrialized nations. We emit a great deal of carbon dioxide. And when we talk about climate justice, then every human being should be entitled to equal rights to use the atmosphere. And thereby the total load on the atmosphere should be limited so that global warming is a maximum of ideally 1.5 degrees. Climate justice is about more than just reducing your own footprint. It's also about adapting to damage which is caused by global warming now and in the future. And rich countries can financially afford to take precautions. So climate justice is about sharing the responsibilities and the burdens and the risks, but also the opportunities. The main goal is to strengthen measures against climate change and limit the global temperature. And what we as Klima Collector offer is the offsetting via our sustainable climate protection projects in countries in global south for organizations or companies or individuals. And the Klima Collector was founded in 2011, so we just had our 10-year anniversary this year. And our office is based in Berlin, but besides our office in Berlin, we have 11 shareholders. And this is, for example, we have Bread for the World or Caritas, and in Austria, for example, we have Horizont 3000. And our services are, for example, the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. You can do it by using our carbon dioxide calculator on our website, or by sending the data to us, and then we support in accounting the carbon footprint. And we offer consulting and the preparation of your carbon footprint, or we advise on possible emissions savings. And then we offer the offsetting with our emission certificates from the projects that we have. And we support in public communication of climate-friendly behavior. And we do educational work. This means, for example, that you can use our free guidelines on the website. For example, we have one guideline for the organization of climate-friendly events, which you can just download on the website. But to consider where you can avoid emissions, you need to account your carbon footprint. And you can account it by using our carbon dioxide calculator. It's on our website. I put the link there, and it's for free. You can just go there and use it. We use the indicators from Klimaaktiv, which you should probably know. It's a non-profit organization, and the calculated emissions are based on the scientifically provided data, and they are updated every year. And you can account their different areas of your carbon footprint. For example, the mobility, which includes flights, but also business trips with train or the car, or as well the mobility to the working place from the employees. And you can calculate the carbon footprint from energy. That means from heat or electricity. And then there's office supplies, like, for example, the paper that you use, or if you have marketing materials, and, for example, food from your events, the catering, or some bigger organizations have the company canteen. And we can account the emissions from websites, or, for example, video conferencing. And we do offer more complex accounting as well, but it's very individual. But how to collect the data for the carbon footprint, the size of accounting, and then your known carbon footprint is often between accuracy and effort, and it depends totally on the availability of your financial, human, and like non-material resources. One option is to evaluate your existing data. This works good for energy bills. You can do an employee survey, for example, to record the mobility to the workplace, or maybe you can read out and prepare data from the travel expense accounting, or if you have no data at all and you can not collect any, you can estimate the data. For example, this works for office supplies. And this carbon footprint is the first step to raise awareness. And when you know your carbon footprint, then you know where to reduce or avoid the emissions. And in the humanitarian aid sector, I think it's depending on the project work and, for example, what materials you use, or the size of your team, if you're working with a small organization or a big one. So I think all of you will have different carbon footprints and individual saving options in different areas. I think that a lot of you probably fly very often, which is maybe sometimes necessary, but you should already check during the project planning which flights can maybe be avoided, because you can do the work via video conference. Or when you have several projects in one region, then you can maybe manage to visit them all at once and not fly very often in this one region. Sometimes it depends on your organization, but it's also a good idea to offer a training for multipliers in the project region, so that the project or the activity can be managed independently on site, and you don't have to fly a lot. But I think there are maybe some organizations where the carbon footprint is very high in the energy sector, and then you need to think about switching your power supplier, or maybe it's an option to install photovoltaic systems on the roof of the organization. And on the organizational level, you can think about introducing a climate management system, and then this also covers the processes related to the emission accounting. And yeah, as the final step, you can offset your unavoidable emission. And carbon offsetting is a mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, and it means that a certain amount of greenhouse gases is emitted in one place, and emissions with at least the same climate impact are reduced elsewhere in a climate protection project. And the principle of offsetting works because for the climate, it doesn't matter where greenhouse gases are emitted or saved. What matters is the total concentration of climate impacting gases in the atmosphere. And the projects are intended to contribute to the worldwide reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And with Klimakollektor has a price of €25 per carbon credit, which is a saving of 1 ton carbon dioxide. And €20 from this goes directly to the projects. €3 are for our administration, and €1 each for the small scale project fund, and €1 for our educational work. And the quality of our projects is ensured by our shareholders, which I've shown you in the first share. They are implementing our projects, and also we received this very good from Stiftung Warentest, which is a German, very well-known consumer organization. And our projects follow the gold standard, which is the highest offsetting standard. It was developed in 2003, and it defines additional social and ecological criteria and ensures that the projects meet the highest standards. And we as Klimakollektor only support projects involving energy efficiency and renewable energies. And our projects make a contribution to economic and sustainable development and support women's empowerment and the health as well. And the countries where our projects are based are India, Nicaragua, Kenya, Rwanda, Cameroon, Cuba, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Uganda. And I brought you one example project. It's with energy efficient cooking stuffs and drinking water filters in southern Rwanda. There are 6,000 cooking stuffs produced and distributed, and the project saves up to 1,073,000 tons of carbon dioxide in 6 years. The project is aimed at the poorest households in the region. Among them are women and children who suffer from indoor pollution and spend a lot of time and effort collecting firewood. And with the energy efficient cooking stuffs, the families consume about 45% less firewood or charcoal compared to the conventional fireplaces, which mean less smoke and decreasing diseases. And throughout the whole project cycle, the local population is involved. And this means that, the project promotes jobs for the local population. The project contributes verifiable to the SDGs 3, 13, and 15. And we have the small scale project funds where we support small projects which are saving less than 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide each year. And I brought you one example. It's with energy efficient cookstuffs in Nicaragua. And the reduction of the project is about 700 tons carbon dioxide per year since 2014. And the last example are some offsetting examples. When you fly from Berlin to Nairobi and back, then you emit 3.14 tons of carbon dioxide. And when you want to offset them, you pay about 80 euro. And which is interesting is maybe that when you go buy a car for 1,200 kilometers, then you emit 0.26 tons of carbon dioxide. And when you use for the same way the train, then you only emit 0.01 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's where you can save some emissions. And yeah, when you stay in a hotel for one night, then you emit about 0.03 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's it.
Thank you very much for your input, Katarina, and for elaborating your services that NGOs can make use of. You've already talked about it, but also later on in Matt's input, we will have a closer look at how you can avoid negative environmental impacts in project planning and implementation. So I have received some questions. The first one, which I guess is a very easy one, is if your service is also available for NGOs outside of Germany.
Yes. Yes, but the carbon calculator is as well in English. We offer it as well in English. So.
Okay, perfect. So please visit the website. You can see the contact details as well in the presentation. Then Katarina's happy to help you.
Yes.
There was another question on calculating the carbon footprint of projects. Is there any other way to calculate it beyond the consumption of fuel and energy and so on? So what do organizations need to consider to measure the activities and materials?
I think this totally depends on your project activity. So I think on the one hand, there is the office, the building where you work in, and then there's the traveling, and then there's the activity in regions, in other countries. And then there's, for example, waste management or water management. I think there are a lot of things, but you can, with this carbon calculator, you can calculate the emissions from energy and mobility. And everything else, you need to contact us, and then I can speak with my colleague who has the overview of all this carbon dioxide indicators.
Great, thank you. So maybe the calculator is a good first step, and beyond all those topics, it would be good to contact you and to have a look together what you can do.
Yeah, the emissions you can find them in the greenhouse gas protocol. They are separated in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So there you can find an overview.
I suggest that we continue for now with our Nina's input. What is to change in the future to be able to integrate environmental aspects into humanitarian action with findings based on Arnina's research again? Okay.
In my research, I also asked the interviewees what they think needs to be done to make environmental mainstreaming easier, or at least possible, in humanitarian aid. So there were many things that were brought up. One of the biggest issue was the role of donors. Of course, humanitarian aid is supposed to be temporary, and that's why a lot of the funding that organizations receive is also quite short-term. However, as we all know, there are times where humanitarian agencies are on an emergency side for the coming 20 years, and this is often not taken into consideration or anticipated by donors. And then it can be that, for example, there was one instance that one respondent told me that they wanted to invest their money in solar system, but then the procurement people came back and said, no, this is not actually possible because we're only supposed to be here for a year. So financially, it doesn't make any sense. And so this is, of course, problematic if you want to start environmentally mainstreaming. Then there's also the issue that donors are willing to fund water tracking or funding generators for the next coming 5 to 6 years. But then in terms of providing support to organizations to actually take the risks and to get technologies that might make environmental mainstreaming easier, it's very limited. So that's something that donors have to work on. Then there's also the thing that environmental mainstreaming often comes up on the proposal stage. So, for instance, organizations have to explain how their activities, how they're ensuring that their activities are not negatively affecting the environment, or how they're integrating the environment in their work. But it doesn't go farther than that. So often donors don't really, ask, okay, were you able to environmentally mainstream? Were you able to meet these standards? Then there's also the issue that donors need to embrace the environment themselves, and if they do not embrace it, then no one will embrace it. There's been, instances where I think there was one story that was told to me where an organization was talking to the EU donor, and they said, the environmental footprint is really important to us. It's something that we want to work on. And the EU said, oh, well, this is actually not something we've been considering ourselves. So even though, they have all these standards from organizations, so there's this discrepancy within donor institutions and also between donors. Then one of the things that has been brought up a lot is that donors need to provide additional funding specifically for environmental mainstreaming. It cannot be that humanitarian organizations have to take it out of their own budget, because then it doesn't motivate them to actually environmentally mainstream. It's often mentioned that humanitarian organizations are already stretched, and so expecting it from their budget would create a bigger burden. But there has been instances where, for example, a donor told an organization, look, we're not going to give you the money if you don't create a project that integrates the environment. And so the program coordinator went to the environmental team and said, okay, let's create something, because if we don't, then we don't get the money. So this can be a bad and a good thing, because it doesn't necessarily highlight the importance of taking care of the environment. It mainly puts the spotlight on the money. But it also incentivizes organizations to integrate it into their work in a way. The important thing, however, is that the standards that donors have from organizations are manageable. There may be organizations that do not necessarily have the capacity to create an entire project where they integrate the environment, and then they're left behind because they don't have the resources. And that's something that needs to be looked at. Another thing that we need to change is our mindset. So often what I hear, when I'm also in webinars, is people are worried that if you focus on, or if you integrate the environment, that it takes away the main objective of humanitarian aid. And that's not necessarily true. Humanitarian aid and the environment, they're very much related. Even our lives, we communicate with the environment every day. And so focusing on the environment doesn't mean that it takes away from humanitarian aid. It adds, it's beneficial, makes your work better. You will cover more vulnerabilities and so forth. And then there's also the problem that humanitarian aid workers don't necessarily see the connection between humanitarian aid and the environment. So, for instance, I had a respondent that said that they monitor their environmental impact when it comes to environmental projects, but not regarding any other projects, like, for example, cash for work. But cash for work is also has an impact on the environment. There's a whole report of how cash has an impact on negative impact or on the environment. So we need to start realizing that it's not only our operational side, but also our program side, our projects that have an impact on the environment. Then there's the issue that, as I mentioned before, when people think of the environment in humanitarian aid, they connect it with the corporate social responsibility unit. So they think, okay, environment, it's something that you have to report on, that you're audited on, but it's not something that you mainstream into the organization. Or when you suggest something, an environmental mainstreaming activity, the first question is, okay, but how will it benefit us? It's not about how will it benefit the environment. It's rather, okay, how much money are we saving because of this? And so the environment is a bit pushed to the side. And I mean, one environmental field advisor said that this is actually one of the best ways of how to incentivize an organization to think about the environment. It's with the money, but that also creates this this idea that we don't have to care for the environment. We have to care about the money that we save and that we receive, and that's problematic. So what has been mentioned a lot, and what's also lacking, is research. So there's not enough research on environmental mainstreaming. Now there's quite there's quite a few resources on the challenges of environmental mainstreaming, not a lot, but it's starting, but it doesn't go farther than that. So we need more case studies, more examples. We need to prove the effectiveness. We need to start monitoring and evaluating the long-term impact, but because there's a lack of resources, financial resources, that's not really being done. Then we need to have more trainings for staff members, and also to have more expertise. So, for instance, there was one story that I was told where in Sudan, organization ordered solar cooking stoves, but then they were not being distributed because they were not right for the kind of food that the refugee community was cooking. So again, of course, you can tell your donor, okay, I did a great job, I environmentally mainstreamed, but at the end of the day, it didn't necessarily do anything. So that we need to have more expertise who really know how to environmentally mainstream in humanitarian aid, so that these situations don't happen. Then in terms of creating policies and guides, that really helps. If you adopt a policy and then you can say, okay, this is our 5-year plan, this is our priority. You can look back and see if you're advancing and if there's something that you need to change. There has been one organization that because of the policy that they adopted, now they are a team of 7, an environmental team. They even recently hired an environmental field advisor in the programming department, which is really great. So these things can motivate organizations. Localization, that's something that was brought up a lot, and so it's very important. You need to collaborate with the local actors. You need to work with the refugee community, with the host community, and they are the ones that know the environment the best. They are the ones that know their needs and so forth. So that's very important. There was one organization that I had interviewed. They were working with the government, and the government signed off on a report that would put tax on plastic bags. So there's a lot of things that you can influence. Then there's the use of local resources. This can be, you first need to assess it, but it can have a positive and a negative effect. Can have a positive effect on the market. But you need to see whether the products that you're using, of course, are actually of good quality, or they might, have worse effects on the environment. That's something that you need to assess. And then, most importantly, it's important that, the headquarters, also the donors first are an example to the organizations, that the headquarters, first environmentally mainstream and then expected from the other offices, so that, you can lead the part, needs to act as an example. So environmental mainstreaming is possible with the right resources and dedication. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Arnina. Very motivating words at the end of your input. Maybe one comment. You've mentioned the donor perspective. To my knowledge, the Federal Foreign Office in Germany plans to fund or already funds carbon offsetting if climate protection is defined as an objective, and the corresponding results and indicators are shown in the log frame, and the carbon offsetting is shown in the finance plan as well. And as far as I'm informed correctly, for BMZ funding, this is not possible yet. So maybe.
Yeah, there's also a Swedish donor that also does the same. Yeah.
We will continue with Matt's input. So Matt will tell us a little bit more about a practical tool that you can make use of for your project planning and implementation. And it's called the Environmental Stewardship tool. And Matt, please tell us what it is, how it works, how we can use it. Thanks, over to you.
Perfect. So I'm going to try to build on some of the things that Katarina and Arnina were talking about in their presentations, and I'm going to discuss the Environmental Stewardship tool, which is a resource that has been developed by CRS, CAFOD, Caritas Australia, and TROCRA. And it really looks at some of the practical things that Arnina was discussing in terms of how we can identify some of the potential negative impacts of our program activities and some ways to mitigate that. So before I go any further, I can take us on the same journey that we all had whenever we were developing the tool. We were trying to define what environmental stewardship meant, and we came up with this definition right here, which is the sustainable use and management of resources, active restoration activities, and actions which result in the positive adaptation of vulnerable communities. So we thought that was a nice definition. However, you might be reading those terms, see a lot of buzzwords, and think, what does that really mean in practice? So I'll provide a few examples. First of all, when we think about environmental stewardship, it's not something that only occurs long term. It's not something that only occurs in the short term. It can occur in a lot of different contexts. So the first example I'll show you is this picture on the left here. It's a woman in central Vietnam, and she's walking through a mangrove plantation. This was a project that Caritas Australia and CRS worked on a number of years ago, with the core aim of reestablishing these mangroves, which had been deforested over a period of many decades in the area. Now, mangroves, they provide a number of different benefits, like restoring soils, helping to reestablish the overall ecosystem, bringing back fish and other wildlife populations. And then once they are mature, they also serve as a buffer to storms and winds and things like that, so they can protect local communities as well. So the act of managing and reestablishing these areas is a great example of environmental stewardship. However, it is one that is much more in the medium or long term, often a little bit outside of a humanitarian emergency or something like that. If we look at the picture on the right, we can go to a very different context. This time we are in Cameroon, and you see a picture of some latrine facilities. And the reason why we equate this with environmental stewardship is because of the materials that were used in their construction. The initial plan for constructing these latrines was to use timber from local forests, but after conducting an analysis similar to the environmental stewardship tool, stakeholders found that this would cause deforestation and have a huge impact on local communities. So after community consultation, they identified an alternative, which would be to use mud bricks to construct these latrines, which was seen as much more sustainable in the short, medium, and long term. So another great example of environmental stewardship, but more on a humanitarian scale. And why are we practicing environmental stewardship? Arnina and Katarina highlighted this quite well, I think, but I'll just provide just a few more points. We know that as practitioners, environmental issues, they can really be underlying and contributing factors to short and long-term crises. Actually, if you look at any humanitarian crisis, there's not one case where an environment or access to resources, natural resources, has some major contributing factor. So we understand we need to be very conscious of that in our work. And we know that addressing and adapting to climate change is really imperative for everyone, especially the most vulnerable communities, which is where we work. So the more that we can do our due diligence as NGOs and also work with vulnerable communities to reduce our impact, the better. And we also know that despite best intentions and best efforts, sometimes both humanitarian and development interventions, they can have negative environmental impacts. And we've seen this in many cases throughout the years. This picture here on the right shows a brick production area in Darfur a number of years ago, and it was being conducted by some NGOs as a way to boost livelihoods in the area. However, a lot of the brick production was occurring in areas where there were existing mango groves, and the brick production ended up depleting and destroying many of these trees, which of course severely impacted food security and livelihoods as well. There are a number of other examples that some of us may be familiar with. For example, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, in a number of countries like Indonesia and Sri Lanka, there were NGOs that provided lots of fishing boats for people to have increased livelihood activities. However, because of the amount of fishing boats that were provided, local fish stocks were depleted for quite some time. So again, a kind of an unforeseen impact on what we would otherwise see as a positive attempt to have humanitarian action. Another reason why we really push for environmental stewardship is, as Catholic agencies where I work, stewardship is a core component of Catholic social teaching. And it also adheres to the encyclical from Pope Francis, which is called Laudato Si, and it looks at responding to not only looking at the needs of the most vulnerable people, or what he refers to as the cry of the poor, but also understanding how the cry of the earth, our environmental concerns, are equally as important and at the same time inherently linked. So again, Arnina was highlighting a lot of those connections, and this aligns with a lot of the things that have been issued in that encyclical and just throughout Catholic social teaching. And also, we understand that many donors are also ensuring that there is appropriate mechanisms in place for environmental stewardship as well. So that's another reason why we look to address a lot of these challenges. So that's really the background that brought us to develop this tool, which we call the environmental stewardship tool. And it was developed through a working group that we call the Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Coordination Group, where 4 agencies, Caritas Australia, CAFA, CRS, and TROCRA, worked to develop this resource that was developed and finalized back in May of 2019. And we conducted a long and extensive desk review to see what other resources and tools were out there. Arnina mentioned the Neat Plus tool, which is a great tool out there that is one of the ones that we looked at. There's another great resource out there called the Green Recovery and Reconstruction Toolkit, which also provided us a lot of great guidance. Now, after that desk review, we realized that there were still a few gaps out there, and that's why we ended up going forward with this tool, because we had a little bit different approach than some of the other ones out there, and you'll see that as I describe the tool a little bit further. So we developed the tool, and we had 3 different rounds of review with lots of different focal points from a variety of different sectors throughout the agencies and our partners, including disaster risk reduction, food security and livelihoods, shelter and settlements, WASH, in addition to program managers, monitoring and evaluation staff, and just a variety of different input. We then piloted the tool in 6 different countries. Again, had another round of review and finalized it, and now we've applied it in over 20 countries. So that's the background of the tool. Now, what is it? All the tool is it's an Excel tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and it really allows for rapid identification of potential negative environmental impacts that project activities may have. So it's a risk register. It's going to tell you potential risk of specific activities. Here on the right is a screenshot from the tool. You can see the column on the left provides some pretty generic statements. And then on the right, the user is asked to fill out if any of their program activities will adhere to those statements. So you would answer yes if you think that, yes, in fact, some of the program activities may result in that, somewhat if you're not sure, but there's a possibility, and no if it's not an issue at all. And then what we do further is in a separate section of the tool, we ask the user to really highlight the specific context of the specific case that they're referring to. So this really allows for you to identify a specific area or a specific activity that this risk is coming from. And then after a series of questions, the risk ranking is provided as a low, medium, or high. So really kind of producing something that is easy and digestible to share with donors, and just also for the project team to take a look at and see how they might address it. And the reason why we've developed the tool as we have is not only for that output, not only for looking at the low, medium, and high, but we want it to be used by not just one person, but the program design team as a whole. So we see this tool is being used to facilitating a conversation and raising awareness about environmental issues amongst people who may not typically be thinking of those types of things. So we see this again as facilitating a conversation. How is it used and when? Typically, we use it during the program design phase, whenever there have been draft activities that have been identified. So when you're maybe halfway through that phase, you would go through with your team and you would utilize it. A lot of people ask how long it takes, and you will see a very large range that I have listed right there, anywhere between 1 to 4 hours. The reason why that range is so large is because we've applied this to both short-term humanitarian projects, but also longer-term, multi-year, 3, 4, 5-year development projects. We find that in those longer projects, especially ones that have multiple sectors, that it could take longer, especially if you're working with multiple people in a project design team. However, if it's a short-term emergency project that maybe has 1 or 2 sectors, it's more likely to take 1 to 1.5 hours, something like that. And in terms of the users, we like anyone who's involved with the project design to be involved in these discussions. So your agency staff, partner staff, if you are designing the project with any government representatives, any community members, which is huge to have their input, anyone that would typically be involved in that is considered to be part of the program design team. And I'll just pause there on that point. Another thing that we are working on currently is developing some guides that could be used as focus group discussions if there are still outlying questions that we have after this analysis that could be then taken directly into communities to ask community members specifically about particular areas that we may still have questions on, because again, we understand that community input is really, really critical in some of these areas. We didn't just want to stop there. So in developing the tool, we didn't only want there to be a ranking of low, medium, and high risk. We also wanted to provide some guidance on how you can mitigate that risk as well. So the second half, or the second component of the tool, provides some specific guidance according to a variety of different sectors about how you can mitigate some of those potential environmental risks. And we have specific information related to disaster risk reduction, food security and livelihoods, shelters and settlements, and WASH, water sanitation and hygiene. The screenshot you can see there on your right is from the DRR tab. So you can see a few different hazards that are typically addressed in DRR programming, and all of the guidance that is provided is seen as environmentally friendly or something that could have positive impacts on the environment while still addressing many of the core concerns of that specific sector. So that's another component we have of the tool. A few limitations. There's always limitations on these resources that we develop. You may be familiar with the term environmental impact assessment, which is something that is typically mandated by law in most every country that we work. Before you take on any sort of construction, whether it be drilling a borehole or developing any sort of infrastructure, oftentimes a detailed scientific environmental impact assessment is required. There's varying levels of input in those EIAs, but typically they're required. Our process is not considered to be an EIA. However, the environmental stewardship tool may flag areas where you should conduct an environmental impact assessment further down the road. And we also like to say that the EST, it's not going to provide all of the answers, but it's going to really give you an indication of areas that you may need to explore a little bit further. And again, it really kind of opens up those conversations with your staff and with other stakeholders as well, in a way that may not have existed before. And just the last point there, you can see that one thing that we've noticed quite a bit that's come up in conducting this analysis is that oftentimes, even though we want to look at the potential environmental impact from our program activities, many times the tool can also flag larger issues that are outside of our project. They could be policy or advocacy issues. Sometimes there's larger scale environmental issues, related to private sector construction or manufacturing or things like that. Our tool can highlight those. We don't have any guidance for specifically how to address those, but it has been useful in looking at the overall environment as well. And just another final thing to point out that we have included in this resource is ensuring that protection mainstreaming is incorporated throughout the process. So we want to make sure that when we are offering activities that can mitigate environmental risk, we're not putting vulnerable groups at further risk themselves. So groups like women, young girls, children, people with disabilities, elderly, or anyone else that we would consider the most vulnerable. So we ensure that there are relevant questions to consider when categorizing risks, and then also developing mitigation activities. That was really, really important for us as we were developing the tool. Just a few impact stories from that we've heard in terms of people implementing the tool. The case I shared from Cameroon earlier is a good example of how an environmental analysis really influenced a lot of the activities that went into a project. A few others, one comes from Indonesia. Following the Palu earthquake and tsunami in 2018, CRS was going to implement a disaster risk reduction project, and we conducted a EST with the team as they were designing that project. And one of the things that came up was, I thought was really good, because you wouldn't initially see it as like the biggest environmental concern, but the staff really saw this as one of the key challenges related to environmental impact. And that was because in DRR projects, there are many, many community meetings that occur. And typically in these community meetings, the project team brings refreshments for the community. Oftentimes those could be in plastic containers. And all of the areas that they were implementing these projects, they had been recently severely impacted by the tsunami. So there were no solid waste management, mechanisms in place. So anything brought into the community was just going to add to further degradation and could just impact communities further. So the staff realized that where possible, they would eliminate plastic products from meetings, such as using compostable cups, like you can see there on your right, or where more appropriate, they would just remove any waste that they did have to areas where there was adequate recycling and further management present. So really good to see that come up in that analysis. And then in another case in South Sudan, one of the projects was calling for drilling of additional boreholes, which the EST flagged was really going to be an issue, especially in some water-stressed regions of the area. So they looked at identifying different ways of harvesting water, but then also looking at existing boreholes and rehabilitating some of these boreholes that had kind of fallen in disrepair, instead of drilling in new areas that may have already been stressed by lack of water. So just a couple of impact stories there. What I will do, we have the tool available online. I will just post the link in the chat. It's also available in English, French, and Spanish, along with a series of trainings and facilitation guides that could be used to roll it out in any case that you see fit. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. There was one question on the NEED Plus tool that you've also mentioned in your presentation. Could you explain a little bit more the difference between those two?
Sure. There are a lot of similarities between the environmental stewardship tool and the NEED Plus tool. The reason why we went a little bit different was we felt that the NEED Plus tool required a little bit more technical expertise to use, and we wanted to design some of the language around the environmental stewardship tool as something that someone who considers themselves a generalist could find a little bit easier to use. We also have seen the NEED Plus tool, which is in a digital format, so you can use it on a smartphone or a tablet, which is great. Often it's very much about kind of just going through and filling out the boxes, which is fantastic in especially a short period of time. With the environmental stewardship tool, we also saw it as a way that we could raise awareness of staff around some of these issues. So by engaging them in some of these conversations, we thought that there was a value add by developing something a bit different. But again, it's the NEED Plus tool is a really solid tool as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Actually, we're already nearly at the end of our seminar. We've heard a lot of different aspects on the environment and humanitarian action, and I think there are still challenges that are not easy to overcome, but also ones that we could focus more on during our work. So Katarina and Matt have given us some concrete ideas how to consider environment more in our work. And through Arnina's input, I think it gets clear that the whole system and all involved stakeholders have to become active to be able to change something and to work more carbon efficient. Thanks to all of you for your great inputs, and I think they really helped us, helped to remind us on the quotation that I've told you at the beginning of the seminar to consider environment more into our humanitarian projects. Before I close the seminar, I will get back to you participants, and to Slido. And I have one last question for you. The question, what do you take out of the seminar? Anything that you would like to try out now, that you would like to change in your work practice, that you would like to recommend to colleagues? Please let us know. Also, if you have any other ideas that have not been mentioned so far, please share them with us. We're happy to collect all of your ideas. Maybe the presentations will help you again as well. Start an assessment. Involve the communities, important topic, yes. Make use of the tools. Offsetting. Involve donors, yeah, that's also an important issue. Great, I see that a lot of you are really motivated. Thanks a lot. We are a little bit earlier than expected. And thanks, Arnina, Katarina, and Matt, for your inputs. I really enjoyed them. And thanks to you as well for your participation. And hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.